Good evening and congratulations. You've just reached the 25th installment of my reading of S. Morgenstern's classic, The Princess Bride. Let's get started, shall we? Let's see. I hate to say this, but this is one of those chapters again where that professor from George Mason University, the Florinese guru I mentioned a while back, claims that Morgenstern's satiric genius is at its fullest flower. And that's the way this guy talks. Fullest flower, delicious drolleries, and on and on. Anyway, this festivities chapter, that's chapter 6, is mostly detailed descriptions of, guess what? Bingo! The festivities. It's like 89 days until the wedding, and every high-born muckety-muck in Florin has to perform an action for the couple. And what Morgenstern fills his pages with is how the 1% of that time entertained. What kind of parties, what kind of food, who did the decorations, how did the seating arrangements get settled, all that kind of thing. The only interesting part, but it's not worth going through 44 pages for, is that Prince Humperdinck gets more and more interested and mannerly toward Buttercup, even cutting down a little on his hunting activities. And more importantly, because of the foiled kidnapping attempt, 3 things happen. Number 1, everyone is pretty well convinced that the plot was engineered by Gilder, so relations between the two countries are more than a little strained. Number 2, Buttercup is just adored by everybody because the rumors are spreading that she acted very bravely and came through the fire swamp alive. And number 3, Prince Humperdinck is, at last, in his own land, a hero. He was never popular with his hunting fetish and all, and leaving the country to rot once his old man got senile, but the way he foiled the kidnapping made everyone realize that this was some brave fella, and they were lucky to have him next in line to lead them. Anywho, these 44 pages cover just about the first month of party giving, and it's not until the end of that things get going again. Buttercup is in bed, pooped, it's late, the end of another long party, and as she waits for sleep, she wonders what sea Wesley is riding on. And the giant and the Spaniard, whatever happened to them? So eventually, in 3 quick flashbacks, Morgenstern returns to what I think is the real story, and trust me, I'm doing you a favor. Anyway, so let's get started. When Inigo regained consciousness, it was still night on the cliffs of insanity. Far below, the waters of Florin Channel pounded. Inigo stirred, blinked, tried to rub his eyes. Couldn't. His arms were tied together around a tree. Inigo blinked again, banishing cobwebs. He had gone on his knees to the man in black, ready for death. Clearly the victor had other notions. Inigo looked around as best he could, and there it was, the 6-fingered sword, glittering in the moonlight like lost magic. Inigo stretched his right leg as far as it would go and managed to touch the handle. Then it was simply a matter of inching the weapon close enough to be graspable by one hand, and then it was an even simpler task to slash his bindings. He was dizzy when he stood, and he rubbed his head behind his ear, where the man in black had struck him. A lump, sizable to be sure, but not a major problem. The major problem was what to do now. Vizzini had strict instructions for occasions such as this. When a plan went wrong, go back to the beginning! Back to the beginning and wait for Vizzini. Then regroup, replan, start again. Inigo had even made a little rhyme out of it for Fezzik so that Giant would not have any problems remembering what to do in the time of trouble. Fool, fool, back to the beginning is the rule. Inigo knew precisely where the beginning was. They had gotten the job in Florin City itself, in the thieves' quarter. Vizzini had made the arrangements alone, as he always did, and he had met with her employer, had accepted the job, had planned it, all in the thieves' quarter. So the thieves' quarter was clearly the place to go. Only Inigo hated it there. Everybody was so dangerous. Big, mean, muscular. And so what if he was the greatest fencer in the world? Who'd know it to look at him? He looked like a skinny Spanish guy that it might be fun to rob. You couldn't walk around with a sign saying, "Be careful, this is the greatest fencer since the death of Wizard of Corsica. Do not burgle." Besides, and here Inigo felt deep pain, he wasn't that great a fencer. Not anymore. He couldn't be. Hadn't he just been beaten? Once, true, he had been a Titan. But now? Now? Now, it's me again. What happens here that you aren't going to read, or that I'm not going to read to you, is the 6-page soliloquy from Inigo, in which Morgenstern, through Inigo, reflects on the anguish of fleeting glory. The reason for the soliloquy here is that Morgenstern's previous book had gotten bombed by the critics, and also hadn't sold beans. As an aside, did you know that Dan Brown's first Robert Langdon book, the one before the Da Vinci Code, and before Angels and Demons, and before the lesser-known Digital Fortress, didn't sell a single copy? It's absolutely true. Even his mother didn't buy it at her local bookstore. Have you ever heard of anything more humiliating? And how would you like to have been Dan Da Vinci Code Brown, and it's your first book, and you have these secret hopes that now finally, you'll be somebody, established, important, and you give it a week before you ask the publisher how things are going, because you don't want to seem pushy or anything. And then maybe you send an email, and it was probably all very professional and polite, and you're Dan Brown, and you dance around the elephant in the room a bit before you drop the big question. "Oh, by the way, any notions yet on how my first book might be doing?" And then his editor, who has been dreading this moment, probably emails back, "Well, you know how it is with your poor man's Indiana Jones. Nothing's taking off like it used to, and it requires a bit of time for word to get around." And then, finally, somebody had to say it. "None, Dan. Sorry, Dan. No, we haven't had yet one authenticated sale. We thought for a bit that new Amazon.com website had a potential buyer, but it didn't quite work out apparently because the cookie, you know what a computer cookie is? Yeah, anyway, the cookie told us that the buyer moved on and ended up purchasing a sports bra. Sorry, Dan. Of course, we'll keep you posted in the event of a breakthrough." Seriously, the book was that bad. Dan Brown has so much disowned it, ever since Tom Hanks and director Ron Howard both put clauses in their contracts with Columbia Pictures that they'd never sign onto a project based on Dan Brown's first Robert Langdon book. Anyway, I've waxed long enough here, and that's the end of my aside. Anyway, Inigo finishes his speech to the Cliffs of Insanity and spends the next few hours finding a fisherman who sails him back to Florence City. So, we're just going to skip, these pages here and continue on. Where was I? Yes, the Thieves' Quarter was worse than Inigo remembered. And always before Fezzik had been with him, and they made rhymes, and Fezzik was enough to keep any thief away. Inigo moved panicked up the dark streets, desperately afraid. Why this giant fear? What was he afraid of? He sat on a filthy stoop and pondered. Around him there were cries in the night, and from the alehouses, vulgar laughter. He was afraid, he realized then, because as he sat there, gripping the 6-fingered sword with confidence, he was suddenly back to what he had been before Vizzini had found him. A failure. A man without point, with no attachment to tomorrow. Inigo had not touched brandy in years. Now he felt his fingers fumbling for money. Now he had heard his footsteps running toward the nearest alehouse. Now he saw his money on the counter, and now he felt the brandy bottle in his hands. Back to the stoop he ran. He opened the bottle. He smelled the rough brandy. He took a sip, coughed, took a swallow. He coughed again. He gulped it down, and coughed, and gulped some more, and then half began a smile. His fears were starting to leave him. After all, why should he have been afraid? He was Inigo Montoya. The bottle was half gone now. Son of the great Domingo Montoya. So what was there in the world worth fearing? Now all the brandy was gone. How dare fear approach a wizard such as Inigo Montoya? Well, never again. Now he's into the second bottle. Never, 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 never again. He sat alone and confident and strong. His life was straight and fine. He had enough money for brandy, and if you had that, you had the world. The stoop was wretched and bleak, though. Inigo slumped there, quite contented, clutching the bottle in his once trembling hands. Existence was really very simple when you did what you were told. And nothing could be simpler or better than what he had in store. All he had to do was wait and drink until Vizzini came. Fezzik had no idea how long he was unconscious. He only knew, as he staggered to his feet on the mountain path, that his throat was very sore where the man in black had strangled him. What to do? The plans had all gone wrong. Fezzik closed his eyes, trying to think. There was a proper place to go when plans went wrong, but he couldn't quite remember it. Inigo had even made up a rhyme for him that he wouldn't forget, and now, even with that, he was so stupid he had forgotten. What was it? Was it,
Stupid, stupid. Go and wait for Vizzini with Cupid?
That rhymed, but where was the Cupid?
Dummy, dummy, go out now and fill your tummy?
That rhymed too, but what kind of instructions were those? What to do? What to do?
Dunce, dunce. Use your brains and do it right for once.
No help. Nothing was any help. He had never done anything right, not in his whole life, until Vizzini came. And without another thought, Vizzini ran off into the night, after the Sicilian. Vizzini was napping when he got there. He had been drinking wine and dozed off. Fezzik dropped to his knees and put his hands in prayer position.
Vizzini, I'm sorry,
he began. And Vizzini napped on. Fezzik shook him gently, but Vizzini did not wake. Not so gently this time. And still nothing.
Oh, I see. You're dead,
Fezzik said. He stood up.
He's dead, Vizzini is,
he said softly. And then, with not a bit of help from his brain, a great scream of panic burst from his throat into the night.
Inigo!
And he whirled back down the mountain path, because if Inigo was alive, it would be all right. It wouldn't be the same. No, it could never be that without Vizzini to order them and insult them as only he could, but at least there would be time for poetry. And when Fezzik reached the cliffs of insanity, he said,
Inigo! Inigo! Here I am!
To the rocks, and
I'm here, Inigo! It's your Fezzik!
To the trees, and
Inigo! Inigo! Answer me, please!
All over, until there was no other conclusion to draw, but that just as there was now no Vizzini, so there was also no Inigo. And that was hard. It was, in point of fact, too hard for Fezzik. So he began to run, crying out,
I'll be with you in a minute, Inigo!
And
right behind you, Inigo!
And
hey, Inigo! Wait up!
Wait up.
Straight up.
Which was the way he ran. And wouldn't there be fun with rhymes once he and Inigo were together again? But after an hour or so of shouting his throat, it gave out, because he had, after all, been strangled almost to death in the very recent past. So on he ran, on and on and on, until finally he reached a tiny village and found, just outside of town, some nice rocks that formed a kind of a cave, almost big enough for him to stretch out in. He sat with his back against a rock, and his hands around his knees, and his throat hurting, until the village boys found him. They held their breath and crept as close as they dared. Fezzik hoped that they would go away, so he froze, pretending to be off with Inigo, and Inigo would say, barrel. And Fezzik, right quick, would come back, Carol. And maybe they would sing a little something, because Inigo said, serenade. And you couldn't stump Fezzik with that one too easily, because of centigrade. And then Inigo would make a word about the weather, and Fezzik would rhyme it, and that was how it went until the village boys stopped being afraid of him. Fezzik could tell that because they were creeping very close to him now, and all of a sudden yelling their lungs out and making crazy faces. He didn't really blame them. He looked like the kind of person you did that to. Mocked. His clothes were torn, and his throat was gone, and his eyes were wild, and he probably would have yelled too if he had been their age. It was only when they found him funny that he found it. Though he did not know it, the word was degrading. No more yelling. Just laughter now. Laughter, Fezzik thought. And then he thought, giraffe, because that's all he was to them, some huge funny thing that couldn't make much noise.
Laughter, giraffe, from now to hereafter.
Fezzik huddled up in his cave and tried looking on the bright side. At least they weren't throwing things at him. Not yet, anyway. Well, thanks for reading with me tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.